Hello, welcome to Module 2 of EDLD 7308, Ethical Leadership and Governance. During this module week, we will be analyzing, critiquing ethics theory frameworks, virtues, values, and moral conflict, outline various theories as models of leadership from an ethical moral perspective, and examine multiple paradigms to apply theoretical perspectives of ethical leadership to complex dilemmas. Yes, my tongue is tied today, so please forgive me. Let's talk today about Kant and Utilitarianism and the virtue ethics. So we're going to cover all three of those during this module. So reflecting on the Kant theory that we went over last week, let's think about what that meant. So based on what you learned, what you've read, what sorts of moral standards would you include in your organization's code of conduct? Be thinking about what would you want to make sure that is included that fits the moral code both professional for your profession and for your own personal ethics. And how would you recommend that leaders monitor and ensure compliance with their code of conduct? How can you make sure your followers are following the code of conduct that you've developed? Remember, we talked about working together with your leadership before you make a big decision on a policy, making sure that all of the stakeholders, teachers, staff, everybody's involved so you can get the different points of view before you're putting a policy in stone, so to speak. Now, utilitarianism, well, that's a mouthful. It breaks down and has some different parts to this. Mostly, how do leaders create the greatest good for the greatest number? When you think of utilitarianism, you want to think of kind of like a large group where everybody decides what the rules are going to be all together and make sure that everybody is taken care of, kind of like a socialism type of government. We talk about moral acts that have two parts, the action and the consequences. It's not focused on individual happiness, but happiness of the community. So not like I would say socialism. I mean, individuals are one part of this, but then you have the larger piece of how is that going to improve the community. It maximizes utility for a greatest number of people. So it's if you watch Star Trek, it's needs of the one, many outweigh the needs of the one, as Spock would say, for any of you Star Trek geeks out there. So it's how do we make sure that everybody is taken care of? And it doesn't mean that individuals are not valued, it's just how are they valued in the midst of the group. So it's more intellectual or moral by nature. So it's not just, what makes you happy, everybody gets a piece of candy. It's everybody enjoys the candy because you may get a piece of candy, but you might not like it. Right, some aspects of utilitarianism. It's non-discriminatory. I mean, everybody is treated exactly the same, which is good and bad. Doesn't take into account differences in the community. It prompts the leader to consider the followers and the goals that they are working towards. So it's like making sure that everybody is working together towards that specific goal. It prompts engagement of people that could be affected. So if I am going to, for example, change the temperature in the school building or office building, I would probably pull in all the people in the office and I would say, okay, what's the best temperature to have in the offices? Is it 65? Is it 75? Is it 85? And then we would try to make sure that we have something that fits everybody, but not everybody's going to be happy because if you say 65 degrees is the right temperature because you're hot-natured, and then you have someone that says, no, I want it at 75, and you end up at 70, nobody's going to be happy one way or the other. Is this the best approach? I don't know. Sometimes you have to take into account equity, that everyone is different. For example, if 5 patients need an organ transplant, this is kind of an idea of saying, all right, I have 5 people. How do I determine which person gets that organ? If 5 people need the transplant, how do I prioritize which one needs it more than the other person? So I give them all a transplant or nobody a transplant? Or how do I pick which person is going to be most successful in that transplant working for them and saving their lives? This does leave room for lying, stealing, and even murder to be viewed as ethical as long as it maximizes the happiness of the greatest number of people. So this could be like a group of people and they're saying, all right, we need this group. We really, really need the apples from that tree for our group to survive. But if we go and steal the apples, even that's morally wrong to steal because they belong to that other group of people, it's okay because we need the apples more than those other people need it. So it's really kind of a challenging conversation of the difference between right and wrong. And it's like for the whole group, well, it's better for us because we all need the apples and you don't need the apples. So we have the right to steal the apples. In fact, we need the apples so much we can kill you and justify that because you have the apples, we need the apples, and you're keeping us from getting the apples so we can kill you because of that. So it's really kind of morally flawed, that whole debate. Okay, so utilitarianism focuses on the goal and the content. It places a great deal of responsibility on leaders and their decision making because remember, they're trying to make the decision that's based on the greater good for everyone. Leaders might not fall into the greatest number of people, so it's just their perception. So it's your perception of what's right for everybody. That's a lot of weight to put on a leader to say, okay, I'm going to make a decision that's going to make everybody happy. Well, not everybody's going to be happy. It considers the consequences of the actions. So whatever I do, if it's good for everybody, then it's okay. Even if it's not good for everybody, but if it's good for a majority of the people, then it should be okay. That makes it a very slippery slope legally. So that's where you'd get your legal challenges is, if I have a problem with, this actually happened up in the greater woods of Yellowstone. They had an issue with the wolves, and the wolves were attacking the cattle, and the farmers out there wanted to get rid of the wolves, so they ended up shooting, and pretty much the wolves came down to the point of extinction. Then they noticed that they had issues with the deer, and they had overgrowth of vegetation, and all of these different things happened. When they brought the wolves back, the whole ecosystem improved. There were less deer because the wolves were eating the deer. Therefore, it was more growth, green growth, because they weren't eating all of the grass and the vegetation, and therefore other animals were able to survive. So making a decision saying, well, it was good for the farmers to get rid of the wolves, but it wasn't good for the environment to get rid of the wolves. So you see how that connects with the fact that the consequences of the action didn't quite come out the way they expected it to come out. Now this is a really interesting dilemma. Let's compare Kant and utilitarian theories. Okay, so think of yourself in Nazi Germany, and Nazi soldiers come knocking at your door and ask if you're hiding Jewish people, and you are hiding Jewish people. Kant would say that your obligation is to tell the truth no matter the cost. Okay? Duty-based ethics. So yes, I am hiding Jewish people. They come in, take the Jewish people, and they kill them. Utilitarian would say lying is okay because it serves the purpose of the greatest good of the majority. So I should lie, even though lying's wrong, but it serves the purpose of the greatest good of the majority of people that are in that house, which are probably the hiding Jews. For the sake of this class, you decide which theory you would choose and why. So reflect on that for a few minutes and say, why would you choose one or the other? Or would you choose neither? How would you solve that problem? Virtue ethics. One of the virtues is humility. It's an accurate view of oneself, assess strengths and limitations of yourself, self-awareness, relationship with others, inherent value of others, awareness of one's place in the larger world, realizing one's importance and insignificance. In other words, a proper perspective of oneself, one's relationship with others, and one's place in the environment. So your virtue is, how do you fit into this world? What is your perspective? And how does that perspective affect the others around you and your environment? Okay, under virtue ethics, a leader often has more authority, which causes a need for increased ethical responsibility. So, looking at that chart, the leader has all of the power and authority. And that makes, they really have to make the right decision at the right time all the time. Word of caution, don't fall into overconfidence or that rules do not apply to you. So sometimes it's like everybody else has this rule and I don't have this rule. And we're going to find an example of that in just a minute. Leadership is a relational process, so one's virtues affect others. So what people see in you, you can't say, well, I'm above it. I'm going to set the rules. Here it is. You all follow them, but I'm not going to follow them. It's kind of like, I really like chocolate. Chocolate's my favorite thing to eat in the whole world. I love chocolate. But let's say I have a limited amount of chocolate. So I'm going to make a rule and say nobody else can eat chocolate, but I can eat chocolate. But nobody else can eat chocolate. Then I lose credibility with my whole community when they watch me sitting in my house gorging on chocolate. So there you go. So virtues can see historically and cross-culturally. So we can see virtues as courage. You can see that everywhere. What is courage in any culture, in any time in history? Justice, humanity, temperance, transcendence, wisdom, and humility. These are virtues, the great virtues of the world. And they have withstood the sand of time. And they're almost the same everywhere, but it might be weighed differently as important, depending on what culture you are in. Now let's make this make a biblical connection to this. This is the story of David and Bathsheba. Now I'm sure you might or might not have heard this story. King David was God's chosen king, chosen one. He was the one who slayed Goliath, the Philistine, and he became king after Saul and took that throne, and he was loved by his people. He was building the temple. I mean, he was doing fantastic. He had multiple wives. But this moment in time is probably one of the most odd stories to put in the middle of his ruling state, so to speak. He was loved by his people. Yet he was not perfect by any means. So basically, I'm just going to summarize the story. You can see it in 2 Samuel 11 if you want to read it. So I'm just going to give you my interpretation of this. I am not a theologian, but this is based on some of the research that I've done on this story. So David is king, and he does have a couple of wives by this point, and his people his soldiers, his army are out to battle. And he it did not go with them, which is ethical issue number one. He did not go with his troops. Normally the king went with their troops. So he stayed back and hung out in his castle, his palace, and he was just hanging out. And one evening he was up and he walked over, and his castle or his palace was higher than it was up on a hill, so it was higher than all the other buildings. So he looks down and he sees a beautiful woman taking a bath. Now this is late in the evening. She is actually by herself taking a bath. And he sees her and he's like, oh my goodness, she is amazing. I want her. Now let's put this in context of the time. She was taking a bath by herself. There wasn't really a maid there. She was taking actually a ritual bath after her menstruation cycle. Women were isolated at that time, during menstruation. And so after they were complete, they took a ceremonial bath to cleanse themselves so they could be clean again, so that they could be around other people. Women were isolated at that time during that cycle. So she really wasn't out there trying to entice the king. She was just taking a bath. A lot of people misinterpret that she was trying to entice him. She had no idea he was looking down upon her. And she was probably even a little depressed because she really wanted to have children, and she and her husband Uriah had not conceived a child yet. And so when you have your period, that means you're not pregnant. So she was probably very sad and was just taking the bath, just trying to kind of pull that all together. Well, she hears a knock on the door, and there are soldiers, and the soldiers say, the king wants to see you right now. And so she goes with them. I'm sure she was quite frightened because her husband was at battle at the time. Uriah was one of the commanding officers of David's armies. And so she gets to the house and David has sex with her. We're adults here. I'm just saying that this was not consensual. She had no choice. A lot of people want to interpret that she enticed him and that she wanted to go. No, she was an honorable wife, honorable woman, and the king forced her into having relations with him. Well, the consequence is that she becomes pregnant. This is not good for either one of them. One, she has violated law. She could be stoned because she had committed adultery. He had lost face in this process. So what he decides is he's going to try to get Uriah back home. So he calls Uriah back from the front lines, and Uriah refuses to leave the palace, and David's trying to get Uriah to go back home to sleep with his wife so they could hide the sin of adultery. So Uriah would think it's his child, but Uriah just would not go back home to his wife. So David sends him back into battle and encourages other officers to put him up front, in which Uriah dies. And then David marries Bathsheba. Poor thing, she is in the middle of this, because not only does she lose her husband, but she is sexually assaulted in the process prior to that. And it's just not a good sense. So David has a lot of issues with ethics in this, if you think about it. He took advantage of a situation for himself. If you talk about virtue ethics, he lacked courage. He lacked humility. He lacked honesty in working through this problem. He took advantage of a situation. Granted, God sent a prophet to speak to him and called him out on it, because God, you can't do anything in secret. God knows everything. And so he gets called out. And sad enough, the story goes that that child that is born of David and Bathsheba dies. And David is just heartbroken for a few minutes, and then he and his wife now conceive the next son, which is Solomon. And it kind of works out. But I'm just saying that if you think about this as an ethical dilemma, where did it go wrong? First of all, David thought he was way above everybody else, that he could do what he wanted to do. It was good for him. It might not have been good for Bathsheba or Uriah or anybody else, but it was good for him. He did not have that ethical, moral compass to stop him from doing what was wrong, not only in the eyes of his community, but in the eyes of God. So thinking about ethics, we can apply it as God taught us in his words, what is right is what is wrong. I think this is a great lesson of leaders that allow themselves to think they're above the law, that they're above the rules of their community, their culture, their society. And that's the biggest lesson from this one Bible story. Now, granted, I'm going to speak of others, but this is just, I would encourage you to read the story, and then you ask the ethical questions. What would you ask David? How could he handle this differently? And what does this teach us about leaders who take advantage of their followers?